We completely gutted this entire railing and made it look brand new again. If you want to learn how we did it, keep on watching. Let's get started.
In my last video, I showed the entire process of how to demo out an existing railing along with installing brand new newels, handrail, and so forth. But in this video, I'm going to show the entire process of how to not only finish off everything that we just installed, but also install these beautiful modern balusters. And as a quick side note, if you want to see some amazing before and after pictures, make sure you stay till the end because the transformation is quite breathtaking in my opinion. The first step to installing these balusters is to prep our handrail along with the flooring underneath it, and that coincides nicely with the simplistic element of applying painter's tape. Now you don't have to apply painter's tape before you start drilling holes into your railing or your floor, but I tried it out both ways and I did see a noticeable difference if I applied painter's tape first before I started drilling, and it reduced the amount of tear out that I saw. Because this is a remodel, I know exactly where each post needs to be, which is a very nice added bonus for doing this type of remodel. There were numerous things that made this project more difficult in the last video, but in this application, it actually saved me a lot of time to make sure that everything was lined up properly. The key tool to have in this application though is a proper laser level, because you're able to transfer those dimensions from the floor up to your handrail in mere seconds, and once they're all laid out, you can just apply a small amount of tape to the holes in the floor, make sure you know exactly where that center point is, and we can start drilling. I'm using a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, and because there's already a hole pre-drilled into these floors, it actually makes it very difficult for that Forstner bit to stay straight. And in order to make sure that we're drilling as straight as possible, I made this template, and by using the template and just gouging the wood slightly, I can align the Forstner head very easily after that gouge has taken place and drill to the depth of approximately a 1/2 inch. I'm sure there are numerous devices out there to help drill perfectly straight into a floor or substrate, but in this circumstance, I only had the tools that I had on hand, and a template like this really makes it easy for anyone to do on any job site. As we make our way up to the handrail, this drilling application is much easier because there's no preset holes, but because we're doing it upside down, if you don't have a helping hand at this point, you're going to make quite a mess. So make sure you have a helping hand if you're able to. If not, I also have a solution for that as well, which we'll see shortly. The solution if you're on a solo mission is just applying some painter's tape to your shop vac hose and attaching it to your drill as you're drilling. It's not going to collect all of the debris as you can see here, but it does vacuum up a significant amount in comparison to if you were just doing it with a drill. Also, as a helpful reminder, I did apply a small piece of tape to our drill bit in order to easily determine that I have the proper depth for each hole. Each hole that's being applied to the railing should be approximately 1.5 inches deep, and each hole again on the bottom of our floor should be approximately a 1/2 inch deep. Since we have a few straight runs already pre-drilled, it's time for some balusters. And for balusters, we're using these black powder-coated aluminum balusters from Stair Supplies. Because they're aluminum, they're extremely easy to cut with a chop saw, and as you can see here, I set up my saw stop because I have multiple cuts the same exact height, which makes it a very quick and orderly process. As for the overall length needed for each baluster, I measured from the very bottom of our floor to the very bottom of our handrail and then added 1 inch. You can go 1.25 inches if you want, but 1 inch is basically all you're going to need because that will allow you to slide the baluster into the top railing and then push it down into your 1/2 inch hole in the floor. As you can see, this is a very satisfying and straightforward process, but that's because we're on flat surface and all these pieces are the same exact size. But when we get to the stairs, it's obviously a different story because we have multiple terrains and multiple measurements to account for. Transferring your measurements from the stair treads to the handrail above it is the same process with your laser level, just it's a lot more awkward and cumbersome as you can see. From the very beginning of this project, we really wanted to provide a more modern and sleek look to this overall space, and these balusters really emphasize exactly what we wanted to go with, because not only are they more aesthetically pleasing in my opinion, but because we're extremely accurate when drilling our holes into our flooring along with our handrail, we're able to completely avoid the need of baluster shoes. And sometimes you see those on areas where they're just screwing the balusters into your handrail as well as your stairs, but that really is more unsightly in my opinion, and this provides a very crisp aesthetic look. Drilling at an angle with a Forstner bit is slightly more complicated than what we did previously, but we're able to tackle it straightforward by starting with the bit straight, and then after we have it at least somewhat seated into the wood, we then start spinning the drill in a completely vertical fashion, and as long as that drill bit is slightly seated when you first start, it really makes the process of drilling out the remainder very easy. Even though we're at an angle, we're still drilling approximately 1.5 inches deep in order to make sure that we have plenty of space for our balusters to move up into that channel and then set in place into our stair tread holes. I do want to take a moment to say a big, huge special thank you to Stair Supplies, who did provide all the materials for this entire project. And the really nice thing is that they love the look of this entire project so much that they actually put it on their own website. So if you want to find this exact style that I did on my project, it's very easy to find on their own website. I'll make sure and leave a link for it in the description box below. Now that all of our holes are drilled, it's time for installing the rest of our balusters. And as you can see, because these are on stair treads, there are multiple different sizes to account for. If you're lucky, the majority of these balusters are going to be 2 different sizes, and that's mainly because on our stair system, we have 2 balusters per tread. But even if you have more balusters per tread, the same principle on our straight runs still apply to our stairwell. I'm taking a measurement from the very top of our stair tread to the very bottom of our handrail and then add 1.25 inches. 1.25 inches is definitely going to be needed in this application because of the fact that we're at an angle and we need a little bit more length than the ones that we did on the straight run. But now that we have our balusters in, it's not quite time to epoxy them fully in place, because we need to account for some cracks. Yep, there are a few miscellaneous seams that are a little bit more unsightly than I want, and in order to accommodate and make sure that this looks as good as possible, we need to fill them properly. And that's where this fill stick by Mohawk comes into play. It's basically just a large crayon that is specifically colored 2 different shades of floor colors, and it can be applied by just pushing up against the wood, but in order to get it into these really tight-knit crack areas, I'm actually having to burn it and melt it down and then shove it into the crack with some type of device. In this case, I'm just using a flathead screwdriver. Also note that the wax is not extremely hot, so I am able to move it around with my finger, but it is much more manageable and easier to get into those tight-knit areas with some type of metal device, especially when you consider the fact that you can heat up a metal screwdriver and then use that to maneuver the wax around, and make it much easier to do so because it can not only maneuver the wax around, but it also keeps it in a more liquid state for a longer period of time. This specific post did have a much larger gap than all the rest because the floor itself was so uneven at this location for some reason, so I just had to deal with what was here and make sure it looked as professional as possible. You certainly don't notice the ones at the floor very often because they're at a lower eyesight level, but in this application where it's the handrail, it's in an extremely high traffic area and right in your face, so you want to make sure that we leave this seam as beautiful as we possibly can. And also know that I'm not pressing down hard, we're not trying to gouge the wood whatsoever, we're just trying to make sure that we have a nice smooth finish at the tail end after we have everything removed. And as you can see, the seam here is barely noticeable. Now we can extend our efforts back to our newel posts in a different way, filling our holes in our newels with plugs. All of our newel posts are tightened down properly, but we still need to fill the holes for our hardware. Luckily for us, the SureTight fasteners that came with the kit already have the plugs cut to the perfect size. You just need to sand it down smooth and apply a proper finish that matches the existing finish. All of our new posts and handrails came with a clear satin finish, and in order to match that, we're going with this Minwax polyacrylic product. Just be careful though, because as you can see, there are multiple species that come with the kit. One is, I'd say, maple, the other one is definitely oak. As we wait for those to dry, let's go ahead and sand down and finish our newel posts. As a quick reminder, we did have to cut the tops off of these newel posts to get the overall aesthetic look that the client was looking for. I diligently sand the top with a palm sander and 320 grit sandpaper, but after feeling it for a little bit, I do quickly realize that we need to soften the edges of that post, because as you can imagine, this is going to be a high traffic area and multiple people are going to be grabbing this post for years to come. In order to make sure it feels as smooth as possible, you want to smooth down those edges so they're not drastically sharp. Once I vacuum up all the loose particles of sawdust, it's time for applying our finish. Same exact finish that we just did previously to our caps, but just realize in order to get the best finish possible, you are going to need to apply multiple coats of finish and slightly abrade the surface between each coat after they're fully dried. It might seem like quite a bit of work, but it's actually fairly simple and straightforward, and you want to make sure that this area especially gets a lot of attention because it's obviously one of the most seen areas, but it also is the area that gets felt up the most. Basically, yes, and that's why we want to make sure that these newel posts are buttery smooth, at least as much as possible. Cleanup is a breeze with this product too, and I would highly suggest going over all four sides of the newel post after you apply each coat to the top. I am using a foam brush on all these application areas as well, which just applies a nice even coverage over the entire area, along with something that I don't mind just easily throwing away after I'm done with it. This product is also extremely fast drying, so by the time I'm done with all these newel posts, it's time to plug our holes. And as you can see, there are very drastic differences between the maple plugs and the oak plugs, so choose carefully. In the past, I have seen these plugs actually be glued in place, but that's normally when these posts are not pre-finished. Because these posts are pre-finished, I'm deciding not to apply glue, especially with the fact that they conceal these areas so perfectly and smooth. However, on the smaller end plugs, I will be gluing these in place because they are so small and I don't want them to move around over time. I don't have pre-manufactured plugs, so I'm using this plug cutter attachment for my drill to create plugs that perfectly fit the holes that I made, but not only fit, but match the actual finish, because I'm just using the leftover material from the handrail to match the overall finish and color of the wood mirror perfectly. I apply a very small amount of tight bond wood glue to the entire perimeter of our plug and then insert it into the hole. Just make sure that before you insert it into the hole that you know the direction of the grain, because if you don't have the right direction of the grain structure, it's going to be much more visible to the naked eye than if it is in the right grain direction. If you are wondering why we have these holes in these specific locations, please check out part 1 of this video series, and I'll make sure and leave a link for it in the description box below, as well as in the comment section. Now that we have our holes filled and the tops of our newels are dry, let's go and apply a second coat. Again, as I noted earlier, I'm abrading the surface slightly with that 320 grit sandpaper and then just applying a second coat of finish. Wipe off any excess on the sides, let it dry, and apply a third coat. You'll be done. But how about we get back to our balusters? You could just leave the balusters as is, as they are right now, but to make sure that they're fully secured properly, you want to apply an adhesive, and in this application, we're applying a 5-minute epoxy by JB Weld. This is a 2-part epoxy mix, and the nozzle that I applied to the tube pre-mixes it as you push it out. So you can pour a perfectly mixed epoxy right into each hole without having to hand mix it at all. This is extremely handy and a time saver. Just know ahead of time that these tubes of epoxy don't come with this nozzle. Don't ask me why, because I personally had to go onto Amazon and find a specific nozzle that will fit these tubes, because they don't sell these nozzles at any large box store in my area, and I have multiple to choose from. Again, I don't know why, but I will for sure make sure that there's a link for these products in my description. As for the top, I am not using the epoxy because I do not want it to obviously drip downward after I apply it into the hole. So in order to have adhesion but still stay in place, I'm applying a construction adhesive that's clear. I reinstall the baluster by inserting the top first and then scooting it into place and pushing it down into the epoxy. Very easy, straightforward, and very minimal cleanup, luckily. Just remember that you are working with a time limit, so don't do too many at once. Make sure you're doing this in sections and you're not extending yourself too far, because technically you only have 5 minutes to work with. After doing this a few times, I found that the best way of going about it was removing a section of balusters at once, then start by applying the construction adhesive on the underside of the handrail, then your epoxy, and then reinstall your balusters. That gives you plenty of time to reinstall the balusters, and if there's any cleanup or necessary adjustments, you can always make it after that. In my circumstance, there was definitely some cleanup needed at the very top of our balusters, because I'm pushing the balusters up into the construction adhesive and then bringing it down. And when you bring it down, it may expose some of that adhesive, and to make the cleanup process a little bit easier, I'm using some mineral spirits, because this clear Gorilla construction adhesive is very tacky, sticky, and it's not something that's going to come off with some water and soap. As I make my way down to the stairwell, the same exact process applies. Apply the construction adhesive first, then the epoxy, and reinsert all of the balusters after that. Just make it easier on yourself by aligning each baluster properly on each stair tread, so you know exactly where each one needs to be placed, and you don't have to worry about getting one mixed up with the adjacent stair tread below it. Truly the last thing you want in a time crunch. As we move on to the last and final section of the stairwell, we make quick work of it because we've done this numerous times, and I can now say that we are done with this beautiful staircase. I absolutely love how this entire project turned out. It did take me longer than expected because I don't have a wealth of knowledge in the fine woodworking trade, but as you can see, even if you don't, you still can produce some amazing transformation results if you take your time. These transformation shots are truly remarkable, and one project that I'm proud to say is one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah,